Did you know that the census is due this year on April 1st? And guess what? This time we can finally count as Caribbean. This year, all you have to do is 1. Check the race box, and 2. Write in your country of birth or ancestry. You can answer by the paper form, online, or by phone. Everybody counts in Census 2020. So count as Caribbean. Yes, we count.
We are live.
Good evening. We are live, and yes, we do count. So get into the censorship. Now, good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to Plain Talk with yours truly, Veron Richards. As always, we always recognize God in all we do and say, and today is no different. We would like to ask Dr. Z to open up in prayer and ask God guidance in all that we do and say. So, Dr. Z, can you please open us in prayer, please?
Of course. Oh God, Heavenly Father, we thank you for a day like today. We had a beautiful day outside, oh God, and I'm praying that as we discuss, oh God, certain things that are so important to our people, that you will open their ears and let them understand that we have their goodwill at heart. Oh, Heavenly Father, just be with us as a panel here today. Be with the ones who are going to expound on what we need to hear and what you need for the listening audience to hear. Oh, Heavenly Father, bless us, guide us. In thy precious name I pray. Amen.
As always, Amen. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for those who've already joined. We have Joan Wellington, Wendy N. Foray Simon, Charmaine Bernard, Judith Gibson, and Natasha Charles. Thank you guys for coming in. Ian Slam Mandy, thank you so much. Today, our discussion is focused around immigration issues that are facing our Caribbean nationals, especially in light of COVID-19. It seems like we can't get away from this COVID-19 stuff. So in addition to our own recurring panelists, Dr. Zorina Frederick and Minister Steve Antoine, today I'd like to introduce you to two additional panelists currently, and maybe at some point we may have another panelist joining us. But our first panelist is no stranger to RIdealong. We have a managing partner and founder of Winter Law Practice, Ms. Diani Winter Funde, a passionate practitioner of immigration law, and for more than 2 decades, Ms. Winter Funde has tirelessly served immigrant families. Author, The 5 Steps of Adjustment Status, and her passion stems from her own personal immigration story. Guys, please make welcome Ms. Diani Winter Funde.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome.
Good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Now, he has been in private practice for the past 23 years with a focus on criminal, civil, and constitutional law. Attorney Ruggle Ferguson, for the past 19 years, has been the managing partner of Siboney Chambers, one of the larger firms in Grenada. Guys, welcome, Mr. Ruggles Ferguson.
Thank you, and good evening.
Good evening. Thank you so much. Well, it's a pleasure to have you guys on. This evening, we're going to be discussing issues I definitely know that's near and dear to all of our listeners, whether they're born abroad or whether or not they're born in the Caribbean and have relatives that are still there. But we're definitely going to try and touch on some issues that are evolving and some of it that has evolved and that is affecting most of our Caribbean nationals at this point. So as I said, welcome. And I'd like to begin by noting that we currently have some issues that are relative to travel/immigration that is fully tied into the pandemic. So any one of you guys, well, actually, I see joining us right now, we do have an additional panelist. I'd like us to welcome Ms. Rachel Okello.
Hi, hello there.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Ms. Rachel Okello, thank you for your sacrifice, because I know it's pretty late where you are.
Yes, it's
She's
11 o'clock at
UK.
night.
Oh Lord, thank you so much for the sacrifice and commitment.
Mm.
She's a UK-based solicitor specializing in immigration, nationality, and deportation law, sitting on the government Windrush advisory panel. She has been instrumental in holding the British government accountable over the Windrush scandal. British by birth, Ms. Okello is of Grenadian parentage. Welcome, Mrs. Okello.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much. So as we were stating, we know that there are a lot of immigration issues that are affecting us, especially in light of the pandemic. And so we would like to address some of those issues during this evening's discussion. And so I would like anyone, one of the things I know that is kind of near and dear and also in the news a lot is the current, what we would say, freedom of movement throughout the Caribbean. And so I'd like anyone to speak to that, anyone on the panel, if you can speak to that at this time, I'd appreciate it.
Veron, I can take that one. I think most notable, when you talk about immigration and freedom of movement, you also have to talk about the travel restrictions that we're seeing based largely on COVID. So there's the travel restrictions, whereas airlines are restricting travel or countries are restricting travel based on their borders being closed. And then you also have behind that, in the case of the United States, the president instituting other travel bans as it pertains to not only the Caribbean, but to worldwide travel as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I know in addition to that, well, Mr. Ruggles, you were going to speak on an aspect of.
Well, in relation to freedom of movement, there are several issues that arise. First and foremost, freedom of movement is a fundamental right that derives from our Constitution. There are several fundamental rights, and as you note, fundamental rights are no ordinary rights. They are enshrined in the Constitution. They are not easily taken away because they are so part of the entrenched part of our Constitution. And therefore, our Constitution, among the freedoms, the more popular ones we may be able to identify with like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association. All of these are fundamental rights and freedoms that we know. The COVID pandemic has pushed the freedom of movement issue to the fore. And you have internally, you have restrictions in freedom of movement internally. You have freedom restrictions in the freedom to travel, move from one country to another, and you have, of course, restrictions on the freedom to enter the country, and that has created in itself much debate. I personally have received many calls, especially from folks abroad, Grenadians who desire to return home, and the question arises, of course, whether or not as a Grenadian citizen, you can be stopped from returning home. And of course, the answer to these questions depend on the particular circumstances. The answer one day might vary from the answer another day. And just broadly speaking, what you have had with the COVID pandemic is the declaration of emergency powers. And for Grenada, it's Section 17 of our Constitution, where in situations of emergency, then a state of emergency may be declared. And with the declaration of the state of emergency come restrictions on some of your fundamental rights. And it happens that the restriction imposed here is restriction on freedom of movement. Just to say, finally, to give others the opportunity, that the no fundamental right is absolute. With all the fundamental rights you have, there are limitations to each fundamental right. and the limitations with respect to freedom of movement, like some of the other fundamental rights, include public health issues, public morality issues, public order, public safety, and defense. And of course, COVID has triggered public health issues. And therefore, with those issues, there are regulations that have been introduced that impose these restrictions on the basis that they are justifiable because of the broader public health issues involved. So maybe I'll just say this by way of introduction and let other panelists chime in.
Yeah, what I would say in terms
rightfully
of
so.
Yeah, what I would say in terms of the movement in the UK in respect of the Caribbean is that people want to leave. Some people want to leave the UK and they want to return to the Caribbean. And there's people in the Caribbean who want to come to the UK. But obviously, those things are not possible. So in terms of practical things which are happening, the UK has extended the visas of anybody who is stuck in the UK and can't leave. So if you were going to leave the UK imminently, if your visit visa, for example, is expired, then they extended it initially to the 31st of May. But they've extended it again because we're still on lockdown. And I think a lot of the Caribbean countries are on lockdown anyway. So they've extended it again to the 31st of July so that anybody who's in the UK and can't leave because of the coronavirus outbreak, but would want to leave, they will get an automatic visa extension until the 31st of July. So these are the helpful things that the government is putting in place, really, to facilitate people who might be caught in the pandemic and can't leave the United Kingdom. And equally, I would say people who are in the Caribbean,
and
particularly
rightfully
if
so, I
they're
think
citizens, they should go to the embassy, the High Commission in the Caribbean island, so that they can get papers to come back on one of the relief flights.
Understood, and rightfully so. Now we've dealt with Grenada's or the Caribbean's perspective, the UK's perspective. Ms. Winterfunde, can you speak to the US's perspective on freedom of movement?
So similarly, in the US, of course, with the lockdown, we have different groups of individuals. We have individuals that are within the United States that are on a visitor's visa, like my colleague just mentioned for the United Kingdom. And one of the things that the service, USCIS, is highly encouraging is that these individuals should file an extension of status. I was truly impressed when I learned that the UK has extended the status of these individuals automatically. Here in the United States, it's a little bit different. If you're on a visitor's visa, you are encouraged, and you know your time is about to be expired, you are encouraged to file an extension of status. That way you do not violate the terms of your visa. We also have individuals in the Caribbean who are waiting. They have received whether their green card status, and they need to immigrate to the United States. We're encouraging those individuals to get in touch with their local consulates, so at least they can go ahead and make sure they're keeping their visa statuses in order.
Valid, understandable. And well, I guess one of the issues would be for expiring documents, not so much for people leaving the US, but you may have some individuals who've traveled to the Caribbean and they may not be US citizens. And so they're having a documentation, whether it's a visa or maybe a passport, that might be expiring. What advice can you give to those people who are there and have no idea in terms of travel or returning back to the US or UK, what they need to do?
So as a general rule, you're not supposed to leave the United States with a document that is about to be expired within 6 months. So okay. I'm giving those individuals a little hand slap right now. Typically, you're not supposed to, whether it's a United States passport, whether it's a green card that's attached inside of a Jamaican passport or a Caribbean passport, your travel documents should at least be good for another 6 months. So say, for example, you slipped through the cracks and you're overseas. I know, and I'll have the other individuals speak as it pertains to Grenada or the United Kingdom. But I know some of the offices are still open, and you should be able to extend, hopefully, extend your passport or renew your passport if you're overseas. If you're overseas with a United States passport that is about to expire, I encourage you to contact the U.S. consulate post. They are not open doing face-to-face, but you can still obtain, and they're corresponding with you.
Okay, understandable. Now, we kind of touched on married visa applicants, people who are married and waiting for their status. And you did state that I guess they should be in touch with the consulates and the governing bodies that would actually assist them with the COVID era in terms of how their processing should go. So my concern is, I know there was a 60-day suspension, and now something somewhat of the proposal might be slightly different than what was enacted. Mrs. Winter Funde, could you speak to?
I think we're referring to the president's executive order that was instituted. We saw that back in April. I think it was late April, about April 21st or thereabouts. And for us, we're calling it what it is. It's an immigration ban. The president has entitled it an executive order. And Mr. Ruggles was talking earlier, Attorney Ruggles, please forgive me, about the constitutionality of it all. And yes, the president can do this. That's a lot of questions I get from individuals. Can this be done? How is this even possible? The answer is yes, because he can defer to national security. He can also state in the case of the executive order that it's to preserve jobs in the United States. So that 60-day order does not affect individuals within the United States. It affects all individuals, not all, there are some exceptions, but it mainly affects individuals that are at the border countries, meaning you're in the Caribbean, you're in Africa, you're outside of the physical United States, and you're in line to be processed. If you're not a military personnel, if you're not a healthcare worker, if you're not the spouse or child of a U.S. citizen, then for 60 days, there's been a 60-day delay or a 60-day restriction on the processing of that, of your visa. We are still waiting. We're not at the 60-day market, but we're still waiting to see what the president will do after the 60 days has run its course.
Understood. Dr. Z, or would you?
Yes. Yes, Attorney Funde. I also was reading that Jamaicans whose visa expired while they are here in America, they are expected to get an extra six months granted to them, but they just have to make sure and apply. Is that what the rule is where Jamaicans are concerned? And I think it's different to the rest of the Caribbean islands.
I don't know that it's different. I know our contact in Washington, D.C. was lobbying or talking about how this would affect Jamaicans. As a general rule, you have to file that extension of status, and that gives you an additional 6 months. I personally am encouraging everyone to do so, whether they're Jamaicans or not. I did see the news article, Dr. Z, where our contact in Washington, D.C. was asking for the extension for Jamaicans. But immigration law as it stands, if you're within the United States and you're on a visitor's visa and that I-94 is about to expire, that document that allows you to stay within the United States, If that is about to be expired within 45 days, you should file for an extension of status. And that gives you another 6 months in most cases.
Now, if they are here and they don't file for that extension, what can be the ramifications if they don't do that filing?
They will go out of status, and right. So there's COVID and there's immigration law. Without COVID in the picture, if you overstay your status in the United States, you go into what we call undocumented status. In other words, you're illegal. You're here without permission. You're here without authorization. You have violated the terms of your visa. Certainly, I could see in the future, and I do not encourage anyone to do this, Dr. Z. I could see in the future where someone has not departed. There's so much evidence. Airlines are closed. Borders are closed. I know for Jamaica, they weren't even taking Jamaicans that were trying to return that were on the cruise ship. Just this week, they were allowed to return. So there's a process even for Jamaicans to return to Jamaica. So there's a lot of evidence out there, certainly where an individual can make the case at a consulate that, look, I was in the United States. I had no intention of violating my status, but all because it's COVID related, I overstayed my visa. It's a good sell to an immigration officer. However, I would err on the side of caution and go ahead and file for that extension of status.
Yeah, if I can
Thank you.
just jump in there. I was going to give the sort of UK equivalent of that, and how important as well it is for people in the UK not to make the normal £2,000 application that you'd normally have to make. They just need to email the Home Office on the special email, and then just let them know that they can't leave the UK. They would have, but for COVID, and then they can stay. So they don't have to pay the extra fees which are required. It seems to be a bit simpler than the American version, but they're not going to get 6 months or the 2.5 years. They are just going to get the extension that the government has allowed, which at the moment is till July. They'll review it again around about July, and they may extend it again further. But for the moment, it's a much more simple process. But if you don't do that, then you do leave yourself open to what we call overstaying and having illegal immigration status.
Right.
And gotcha. I'll jump in. I'll jump in, Veron.
I know we have some listeners in the UK.
Sorry. Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Veron, I didn't want to cut you off, but I do want to piggyback on what my colleague in the United Kingdom just said. If you're here on ESTA, meaning you're here on the visa waiver program, mainly for the Europe and some South American countries, you do not have to file an extension of status. We do have what we call it's like a standard departure. So you just take your documents to a border patrol office and say, I cannot leave, and they'll automatically extend you. So if you're here on an ESTA, you do not have to pay the fee. And our fees are, I think, a little bit over $300. Wow, £2,000, that's a lot. That's definitely a lot.
Yeah.
Yes, now in relation to the Caribbean,
understandably,
probably.
Well, I was gonna ask because I know we. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I was saying in relation to the Caribbean.
No, I was gonna actually.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
No. Go right ahead.
Yes.
I was actually gonna ask Mrs. Ocallo. I wanted to ask Attorney Oak, I know we do have some UK listeners, and they may need that provide, or is there a number that they can call to find out what the emailing process is?
Yeah, they can email. They can go on to our. Yeah, they can go on to our website. That they need to. Yeah, we're at Clarity Visas. So if they go on to our website, clarityvisas.com, and just ask for that link, the email, then we can just email them back that, and then they can make contact with the Home Office themselves.
Great. Thank you so much for that information. Attorney Ruggles?
Yes, I was saying in relation to the Caribbean, it's of course not so much a visa issue. I think because the borders are closed, both for intra-regional and extra-regional travel, the issue more or less for Grenadians who are in Grenada and wish to return to their respective places of abode. The issue, of course, is when can they travel realistically? And of course, the issue will be for Grenadians who live abroad, can they return home? And of course, all that depends on when the borders will be open. We have had in the past few weeks, I believe last week and only this morning, I understand you have had several employees on the cruise lines coming in. I believe over 40, I understand, came in today. And the issue of freedom of movement, again, applies not just to the entry, because upon entry now, persons are subject to a 14-day quarantine period. And of course, that is all because the emergency legislation is in place. I saw a comment pop up a while ago, which said that notwithstanding the Constitution, there are certain regulations that can be put in place. And the answer to that is yes, but before those regulations are put in place, there must be a state of emergency declared. There are certain steps when you have to depart from the constitutional requirements that must be taken. In the case of Grenada, like in the case of most of the Caribbean countries, what you had first and foremost was a declaration of a state of emergency by the Governor General. And that declaration of that state of emergency, when Parliament is not sitting, can only remain in force for a period of 21 days. And that 21-day period ended sometime in April. And what the Constitution provides is that the Parliament can then pass a resolution to extend that period to 6 months. And that was done. So Grenada remains, like most of the other islands, remains under a state of emergency. And it is that state of emergency that allows, for example, the continuation of a curfew from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m., and that allows all the restrictions that we're speaking about now, restrictions from leaving your house at particular times, restrictions as to shopping, restrictions as to which businesses can operate, restrictions for entering and leaving the country. Now, the issue will be, because there's always this tension between rights and freedoms on the one hand, and the wider obligations to society. As the Constitution itself states, basically your rights end, your individual rights end where they begin to infringe on the rights and freedoms of others. And the Constitution itself provides the limitations. So if those limitations are not contained in the Constitution, then you cannot use an arbitrary reason for imposing limitations. Now, it's clear that COVID-19 is a public health issue, and therefore it can be used, because public health issues are form the basis of the exceptions to absolute freedom of movement. In other words, the Constitution says you can limit freedom of movement for the purpose of wider public health issues. Now, the issue, again, will be for persons abroad and for persons traveling. When I come to Grenada, do I have to be subjected to a 14-day quarantine? How long will that last? at what period or what point in time will the justification of keeping the borders closed and imposing a requirement for persons to go to quarantine, when will that end? And it really depends.
Okay, so on that note.
Sorry?
Yeah, so I was about to say, on that note, if we can expound on that, I want to take a break, and then we can definitely speak on the quarantine issue. We can just take a station break for a moment, and we can definitely come back to that. I definitely would like to expound on that a little bit more. Okay, but let's hold that.
Hey, did you know that the census is due this year on April 1st? And guess what? This time we can finally count as Caribbean. This year, all you have to do is 1. Check the race box, and 2. Write in your country of birth or ancestry. You can answer by the paper form, online, or by phone. Everybody counts in Census 2020. So count as Caribbean. Yes, we count.
Call on the line. All you have to do is 1.
Okay, we do have a call online. Call it. Okay, I think we'll take this call before we continue, Mr. Attorney Ruggles. Guys, you're listening to Plain Talk Live. Veron, hold on one second, call. I'll be right with you. Just letting everyone know that you're listening to Plain Talk Live with yours truly and our panelists. And we just want to let you know that we're dealing with some immigration issues that are affecting our Caribbean nationals right now. So share the live, let everyone know that what we're discussing this evening could be of utmost importance to them. So feel free to share the live and have everyone tune in. Thank you. Thank you for holding, caller. Caller, we'll take your question.
Yes. How long can a green card holder stay outside the United States at this period with the COVID-19?
Thank you for that. That's a very interesting question. Any one of our lawyers would like to address that? What I would say.
You want me to?
Funding.
You want me
Yes,
to take that
funding.
one? I feel.
Yes, please.
Okay. I feel like I'm taking over, but if any of the other panelists would like to answer, I'd more than likely defer.
Well, because it was U.S. based.
No, it's fine. I don't know anything about American law, so you take that first.
All right. Thank you, counselors. Thank you to my colleagues. So caller, it depends. I want you to write two things down: 6 months and 12 months. So it depends. Typically, you're not supposed, if you have a green card, you're not supposed to be physically outside of the United States for more than 12 months. After 12 months, the presumption is that you have abandoned your residency, and there are some procedures that you'd have to go through in order to regain your green card. However, if you are interested in pursuing naturalization to become a United States citizen, and you stay for more than 6 months outside of the United States, they will call that a break in residency. So you're essentially starting over that 5-year period. So 6 months if you're interested in pursuing naturalization or citizenship within the United States, 12 months, after 12 months, the presumption, and I say the presumption because we're under COVID-19 umbrella, and certainly we're going to have some circumstances where someone might be outside of the United States for longer than allowed on their green card status. Again, I encourage individuals to get in touch with the U.S. consulate post in their country and to kind of update them on what's going on. So there's a record or there's some documentation of what exactly is going on, why they're outside of the United States, and why they're unable to return.
Thank you so much. Cole, I trust that answers your question. Paul, are you still online?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for calling in. And we encourage everyone else who has questions of any kind. This is the time you're going to get it. You're actually going to get some sound advice for free. So feel free to give us a call at 718-701-5720. And you have perspectives from the UK, the US, and the Caribbean. So take advantage of it, guys. This is fabulous. Now, I do have Attorney Ruggles. We were dealing with the issue of quarantine and others in the Caribbean, and I'd like to get back to that. So can you expound on that, please, for us?
Yes, I was saying the borders are closed, but you have over the past week or two, you have had the employees on the cruise ships, Grenadians on cruise ships. They have been returning, about 40 returned, or just over 40 returned today. Now, most of the returning nationals, they have to go through a 14-day period of quarantine to ensure that issues of the virus are kept at bay and under control. If so anybody coming in, the rule is that you must be subject to quarantine. I know there is debate going on among the heads in the region, of course, a serious issue of the opening up of the borders, whether for intra-regional travel alone or for extra-regional travel. The talk that tourism is severely affected. Now, again, the issue arises. If the borders are opened up, whether persons coming in will then be subject to a 14-day quarantine. If you are coming for a vacation, a 14-day vacation, and you have to spend it in quarantine, then then of course it makes no sense for you to come. And I was just establishing the principle as to when all of this would go away depends on the circumstances. Dr. Fauci in the US, he made the profound statement, is really that the virus determines everything. Everything is determined by the virus and not so much what is our desire, what we desire to see. Of course, everybody wants to see the economy back up and running. But in these exposed islands where the health system is not as developed as it is elsewhere, if we have a serious outbreak here, then it would mean, many persons being affected, and you have possible deaths. So far, we have had no deaths, and we have been able to contain the figures. But it's very important that those continue to be contained. Now, while this is happening, then you have the fundamental rights relating to freedom of movement. Even some people raise the issue of freedom of religion and the right to worship freely, to go to their churches and so. All of that relates to public health issues. So it all depends on this principle, as it says, proportionality. If there comes a time when there is no COVID, when the situation has subsided, but you still have emergency powers running, then it gives some justification to challenge it for those who feel affected, those who feel that their fundamental rights are being affected, then they are free to use the vehicle of the court to go to challenge it. But it all depends on whether or not the measures that are put in place that impose restrictions on fundamental rights, whether they are proportionate to the situation that we face. If the answer is yes, then the state is operating within the context of and confines of the Constitution, notwithstanding what may appear to be violations. If, however, it is not proportional and that it's excessive in the circumstances, then one can always go to the court, which is the judicial arm of the state, to seek to have your rights vindicated. So there is that freedom of movement. And of course, there's a wider freedom of movement in the Caribbean because under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, people from one state can go to another state. They are automatically entitled to a 6-month stay. There was a case in Trinidad recently, I believe only last week, where there was a Bahamian. I'm not too sure of the details, but what was reported is that he had come in, his girlfriend is Trinidadian, he had come in since last year. He had overstayed his time, and there was an attempt to deport him to the Bahamas. He took the matter to the court, and the court overturned the deportation order on the basis that there was no justification in the circumstances to deport him. As I say, I don't know all the details, but these are practical issues that arise because for Caribbean nationals, under the free movement, the issue of free movement, then you are authorized, you have an automatic 6-month stay in another Caribbean country. And if you have to be sent back, there must be justification for so doing. But we can expect serious tensions, especially with the unemployment situation and people moving probably from one state to another state to get better opportunities. You probably could expect some tensions developing in the next few weeks and months, with people guarding their borders and guarding their jobs much more jealously. And the issue of freedom of movement, probably if we are not very watchful, can take a backseat. So these are some of the practical issues that exist in the Caribbean. So in ordinary times, where there is no state of emergency, a national cannot be stopped from returning home anytime he or she wants. In fact, when the borders are open and a national wishes to travel, then that national cannot be stopped or denied entry. The restriction that may be imposed, depending on the time that person comes, might be an internal restriction subjecting the person to quarantine. We cannot deny a national entry.
Duly noted.
Veron, I got a question here. I got a question, Veron. Hello? I got a question, Veron. Hello? Can I go ahead? In regards to the doctor from Grenada, the attorney from Grenada, do you have any kind of limited, would you take into consideration what state in the U.S. or what part of London a resident or someone is coming from, in regards to whether or not, based on the like for instance, New York City, we know that it's been kind of difficult down there for New York folks. Would Grenada take into consideration what area someone is coming from as far as when coming to putting them into quarantine?
Yes, I believe that will be a practical consideration. Once the borders are open, you can't really stop the person from coming in once the person is a Grenadian national. But for public health reasons, and those public health reasons must be justifiable public health reasons. If you are coming from a state in the United States where COVID is prevalent, then particular restrictions may be imposed. And again, that brings into question, at least theoretically, the issue of discrimination. Discrimination against one person who comes from one state versus a person who comes from another state. So that's an issue again, but justification can be found if the person is coming from a state that is known to be prevalent with COVID-19, because the state has an obligation, a wider obligation to protect all the citizens. So it is really your individual rights versus the rights of the other members of society. And that is always the tension that exists, the balancing act. You have the individual rights, but the most simple way to express it is that those rights end where they can possibly infringe the rights of the wider society. So if a man has the right to enter Grenada, he's a Grenadian national, and he's carrying COVID-19, then that right does not extend to just coming in and then infecting several other people. then gets affected. So is that balance that always creates a tension that constantly exists.
So what if they come into the border and they could present like a test, like, you know, they test negative, and they could present something that, hey, I've just been tested and this is my evidence that I'm not positive. Would you guys take that into consideration?
Well, first of all, it's not me, eh? What I suspect is that once the borders are open, then some testing, the testing aspect of it will have to improve, and probably everybody coming in will be subjected to a test, because part of the problem is that if you open your borders, you can't quarantine everybody because physically there is insufficient accommodation. Even right now, the accommodation is insufficient even for the Grenadians working on cruise ships out there. And that's why they have to stagger the time periods that they are coming in. So we have 40 coming in now, who came in today. And it's an expensive process. So I suspect once the borders are open, then what may happen is that you have mandatory testing on the airport itself. You might have testing at the point of departure and testing at the point of entry. And if then you are tested positive, then you may be quarantined. But if you are tested negative, then that, most likely would not be a problem. But that is a consideration, because
Attorney Ferguson, what we have to also take into consideration is that you can test negative today, and in the next 2 days, 3 days, you could test positive. So it's a very ticklish situation. Precisely.
And then because, again, Dr. Fauci, as he said, it's really that test is a snapshot for that particular moment in time.
That's right.
So you may have left New York free, and then you went on the plane, and then you got it on the plane.
That's right.
And you landed. So it's really a challenge. It is a serious challenge, especially for the smaller states that lack capacity. Once those borders are open, and it's interesting, I believe the last time the Prime Minister gave an address, there was talk about opening interregional travel during the first week in June. And I believe the debate is still continuing in relation to that particular issue. But the reality is, you can close your borders now, decide who is coming in, plan well in advance, know that 40 Grenadians working on a ship will be coming today, make arrangements for quarantine, and that happens, it's organized. But if you open your airport, then it's just everybody coming in. And how then do you organize for quarantining people? At this point, I think certain hotels, certain places are designated for quarantining people. But these hotels themselves will have to soon open to the public and continue their own operations. So it's quite a challenge.
Understandable.
But Attorney Ferguson, how about the way that it's being done? And Solicitor Okello, you can probably verify that for me. I read that in the UK, they are requiring that anybody, and that goes for even UK nationals coming in, they will have to remain quarantined for 2 weeks, and they will be tracking them. They're not really putting them in a quarantine area per se, but they'll be tracking them. And if they find that they're not being quarantined and they're not quarantining themselves, there's a fine that I'm saying this because I read that today. Solicitor Okello.
Yes. So I don't know whether you said if there'll be a fine. Is that what you said? If they don't.
Yeah, if they find that they're not quarantining themselves.
Okay, so for the UK, to understand where we're at in our coronavirus fight against corona, all the arguments which were just our colleague there in Grenada raised about human rights, proportionality, and the right against the individual versus the right of the state is exactly what's troubling us here in the UK. So these issues of forcing somebody to quarantine is what the UK said they're going to put in place. But people then will say, you can't detain me because you're kind of detaining people or causing them to be detained, and you don't have the right, it's not proportionate to do that. Equally, they're requiring people to be tracked as well, and people are saying that breaches our right to privacy if you force us to be tracked against our will. So we're having some serious debates in the UK, whereas you hear those debates also happening in Grenada, where nobody, thank God, has died. In the UK, we're counting almost 40,000 people, extra people who have died as a result of coronavirus in the UK, but we're still having the same arguments about human rights and civil liberties. So what the UK can or can't put in place is still, the jury is well out, because the people here, even our lockdown, people are not following the lockdown properly. So I think that's where the government is struggling in a way. It's our democracy that's causing us causing the government, I suppose, a difficulty. So all those things that you may read about are probably not going to happen because the British public won't accept it. We hold our human rights, and it's just not going to be enforceable.
And that's where the problem begins.
Thank you so much for that.
Go ahead, Veron.
Yeah, and I guess that's okay. Well, we touched a bit on deportation. I think we would probably do a station break at this time because I really want to get in depth with some of the issues regarding deportation. And I would definitely want to take a break so we can prepare for that segment. So station break at this time. And please join us so we can expound on deportation a little bit in a few. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming back. We dabbled a bit in terms of travel and freedom of movement, and we talked about how it's affecting the US, the UK, and the Caribbean. And we also want to speak about the deportation issue. And we're aware that recently we have quite a few nationals that are being deported back to the Caribbean and so forth. And in light of this COVID era, we'd like to know what are some of the responsibilities on the US end and on the Caribbean end that are placed on the governments regarding accepting or rejecting deportees in terms of even a treaty that is signed that you must is the Caribbean do they have to, is it mandated that they have to accept deportees even in this COVID environment, since they may have been affected abroad?
So I'll speak to the U.S. and maybe Attorney Ruggles can speak as how Grenada is doing this. As it currently stands within the United States, the deportation calendar is still active. So in any immigration court, you'll have your deportation calendar. It will surround those individuals that are detained, meaning they're in custody and they're awaiting whether it's their hearing or they're in some process of removal. And then we also have the non-detained calendar. So for the non-detained calendar, all those hearings have been postponed. The court is not hearing those. For those individuals that are detained, their cases are being heard. We've had some success in our office in getting bond for certain individuals. For example, if they've had no criminal arrest, but they're kind of the run-of-the-mill individual that landed in deportation proceedings. We've had limited, I won't brag about the number of success, but we've had some success in getting them bonded out of the detention centers, in large part due to COVID. For others, what I have seen is a fast track to deportation where their hearings are moved up. The judges are still hearing their cases largely via teleconference. So you can have a hearing for an individual, and let's talk about due process rights. You can definitely have a hearing, and we've had them for individuals, and your client is on one end of the line, the government attorney's on the other end, you're on one end, and the judge is there as well. And this is the hearing during COVID. And yes, they can be ordered removed from the United States. We saw in the case of Jamaica, when you talk about the country's responsibility, where the prime minister was holding out and accepting a certain number of deportees from the United States. And this administration said you have to accept them or else. The or else is we're going to restrict traveling from your country, similar to what we've seen happen in Nigeria. So the responsibility of the home countries, Jamaica, and I'll have Attorney Ruggles speak to Grenada, is that they have a responsibility to accept their natives, their nationals. They really do. As for the United States, the detained calendar, as far as removal proceedings are concerned, they're still active, and individuals are being ordered removed from the United States.
Fast tracked. Now, yes. Solicitor Okello, can you speak to the UK's process regarding deportation at this point?
Well, according to the Home Office, they'll say that somebody's deportation is still ongoing, although at the moment, what they normally say is the deportation itself is not imminent, because at the moment, they're not even requiring people to report. So normally, if you're subject to deportation proceedings through criminality or because you've overstayed, the Home Office will often require you to report monthly or weekly. And then normally when you report, which is going on to sign at the Home Office, just to say you're still around, they'll grab you, and then next thing is they try to put you on a flight. So at the moment, they're not requiring people to even report. So that tells us that they're also not really pushing for actual deportation flights to go forward. I did hear of a flight going to Europe. I think somebody was deported to Poland recently and was sent back for various reasons. But in terms of the long-haul Caribbean flights and the clients that I have, they're not being required to report, and therefore deportation is more or less halted. And I think it's more to do with the safety and the social distancing. Mm-hmm. In terms of people's court cases, we're doing those over the telephone. We're not like in America, actually. Our clients are not actually on the phone. They're still in prison or in the removal center. It's just me, the judge, and the Home Office. So the client, I mean, I recently got a bail for a client who didn't even know that we were actually going to court for the bail hearing. And then he was just released. He was successful. He was released from prison. So the UK is sort of trying to wrangle with trying to follow the rule of law and due process, but also trying to keep everybody safe. So at the moment, the Home Office as well is closed for processing applications. So if your leave to remain is going to expire and you want to stay here temporarily, there's that email that we said earlier. If you want to stay here on a long-term basis, then you should still submit your application and pay for it online as required. But the actual appointment and the process is not going to continue until we get past this coronavirus situation. And equally, people who are abroad, they can still apply to enter into the UK. But the whole process is not going to happen because, again, you need to go for your appointment, and there's no appointments in practically all the countries around the world. Our UK embassies and high commissions are closed. So things are ticking over, but they're not actually progressing.
May I add a question concerning the COVID-19? Are the governments who doing the deportation, like the US government, the UK government, are they compelled to let the other governments know where they're sending these deportees to, are they compelled to let them know that the deportees are coming in with COVID-19 positive results or not?
Well, in the UK, we're not testing to that extent in the UK. And to be fair, what I know about the Home Office, they wouldn't, as long as they could safely remove somebody, they wouldn't care if somebody had COVID-19. So, for example, the Home Office, our threshold for people to be able to avoid removal if they're not well is very high. They say if you can be deported and die with dignity in your country of origin, then that's fine. So even if somebody had coronavirus and could go and have their coronavirus and even perhaps die in their country of origin, then the Home Office doesn't have any problem with that. The problem they would only have is with social distancing. So they may or may not tell the country of return that the person has coronavirus. But I don't think they probably wouldn't, to be fair, because they might not be accepted. But in terms of the Home Office here, as far as they're concerned, if you're a foreign national, you're good to go, good to be deported.
So they,
but then from a humanist.
Wow. So they will put a whole flight of people at risk by not doing that.
Exactly.
And this airline is traveling with so many other unsuspected people with a COVID positive person on there. By the end of the flight, probably half of them, and that actually did happen on I think a flight to Mexico, where 3/4 of the other people on the flight ended up having tested positive for COVID-19. Do you think that's fair?
Well, it's important that I respond to that more fully, really, because at the moment the UK are not, as I said, they're not even requiring people to report. So they're not deporting people at the moment anyway because of the social distancing. So it wouldn't be fair for me to suggest that they're putting people on a plane who have coronavirus.
Not the UK, the US. The US.
Oh, the US? Yeah. I have no idea.
The US,
I defer to my colleague.
The US.
So I won't go that stretch either and say that, because I know the last flight that left for Jamaica, that was pre the high point of COVID-19. I imagine there always routine in place for removing individuals from the United States. And I'll leave it at this. There was a gentleman in New York. He was from Germany, and I think he was almost 100 years old. And he was removed from the United States by a medical ambulance. He was deported back to Germany. So take that into consideration when you think of removing individuals from the United States. Certainly COVID-19 has played a factor. I would imagine, and Attorney Ruggles can speak to this, it will be incumbent upon the Caribbean communities or the home countries to make sure they're doing their testing, they're doing what is required. But I know the last flight from the United States to Jamaica was early March. I know there has been a flight to Haiti, there's been a flight to Mexico. So it is incumbent upon the home countries to do their due diligence in accepting their nationals.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
And I do have one of our commenters, Mavis Joseph, who spoke to that. Basically, I do believe it would be the responsibility of the receiving government to ensure that they do the necessary quarantines.
Yes.
Attorney Ruggles, can you speak to that?
Yes. Well, on issues of deportation, again, it goes back to the issue of receiving your nationals. You cannot deny your nationals, whether they are returning voluntarily or being deported. And of course, the country of deportation will be your country of citizenship or nationality, as the case may be. So you can't really, theoretically, you can't refuse them. But this deportation issue exposes the vulnerability of many of our states in the Caribbean, and the importance of regional unity. Because if a country like the United States, large and powerful as the United States, says, listen, I'm sending back your people, and if you don't accept them, then there are adverse consequences. In fact, threats usually accompany those directives. It more comes in the form of a directive rather than a request. If each country has to take a position on it, especially in this COVID period, I know Jamaica in particular, many flights are destined to Jamaica. And you have to accept them because if you don't accept them, one, there's a legal duty to accept them if they are your nationals. But, the committee among nations, diplomatic discussions between nations in terms of how best to achieve a smooth transition, even though a deportation is supposed to take place. You actually should inform the country because somebody is leaving your country and you need to contact the host country, the receiving country, to let them know. So there is actually a duty on the part of that state to let the country know that the person is being sent back, so adequate arrangements are made. But, you may have deportation based on persons just overstaying the time, or you may have what you might refer to as the criminal deportations, persons who would have been convicted of crimes. And that, again, may pose certain challenges to the countries. These countries that don't have the capacity to deal internally with existing crime, much less to be exposed to a situation where you have many nationals returning, many of them not even growing up in their home country, but growing up abroad and acquiring very professional ways of committing crime and so. And that really poses a challenge. For example, even our prisons now, with new crimes, the authorities in the prison's already overcrowded, one, and two, there is always the tension when new persons detained are to be sent to prison, because you don't know whether somebody coming from outside is going to bring COVID in a contained environment like the prison. And then you have this spreading like wildfire. Our countries really don't have that kind of capacity to receive all these deportees, in particular from the United States, because that's the country that probably pursues the most aggressive deportation policy. But for Jamaica, Grenada, I'm not too sure. I know there are one or two deportees who came back over the last few months, but they come back in much more significant numbers in Jamaica. And, the implications for crime in these countries, these are serious repercussions that you have to look at. But the reality is, if they are your nationals, then you have to receive them. And again, it really underscores for small island developing states the importance of developing a regional position on many of these issues. Because Grenada may not be able to negotiate individually with the United States or even Jamaica or so, but as a region, as CARICOM, some kind of arrangement can be worked out, because you're talking about 15 states speaking in unison about a particular issue, because it affects all states the same way, but just probably to varying degrees. Yes. But the bottom line is that if you are national, then that's where, in other words, they wouldn't send a Mexican to Grenada and say Grenada has to accept a Mexican. They'll have to send the Mexican to Mexico, but if you are Grenadian, they can send you back to your home country.
But Attorney Ferguson, seeing that you so graciously talk about maybe the states should come together on the CARICOM, maybe you could think about getting a group of you guys together, lawyers down there, and forming such a group. That might be really great for the Caribbean.
Well, I mean, I can try my best individually in my capacity as president of OGBAD, as the Organization of Commonwealth Caribbean Bar Associations. We can do what we, can do from that end. But ultimately, the leaders are the ones with the power to take decisions. And that's why it is so extremely important to, for Caribbean unity, this issue of Caribbean unity and regional integration. These are not just words, but it really, it's a matter of survival in the long term in a very fiercely competitive world. I think more and more, even in the face of challenges like COVID, like the hurricanes, that Caribbean leaders more and more appreciate the value of unity. So, for example, when there was a hurricane in the Bahamas, and there were calls, to CARICOM as CARICOM would send experts from throughout the region to deal with the issue. We had our own expert from Grenada, the head of NADBA here, going across. And I think more and more over the years, because of those challenges and with COVID now, that hopefully our leaders would appreciate much greater the importance of regional unity and the importance of speaking with one voice. Because with unity carries strength.
I was going to say, in the UK, the CARICOM heads of state, or high commissions, I should say, they have put together a group. We have been interrupted by the coronavirus, but certainly I've been contacted to form part of a group of lawyers that we can deal with these issues as one voice in the UK under the sort of CARICOM umbrella. Especially around deportation, Windrush, and other issues that affect the Caribbean islands, nation states, in terms of speaking with one voice. So that's a good sign that's happening over here in the UK.
Definitely.
Good. Great.
I think that's great. And one of the questions, I guess, would be more so regarding imprisonment into the Caribbean. My concern would be, are they not only putting them in population, or less people being imprisoned, or less deportees being imprisoned coming into the Caribbean than normal because of COVID-19?
Well, can I just say something? I don't know how it is with American deportees, but certainly people who are deported from the UK going to any country are not normally put in prison. In terms of the UK, they'll keep somebody until a particular date, their earliest deportation date, if you like. And if you agree to leave the UK by that date, then you'll be deported, put on a plane, and released into your country of origin. And my understanding, in fact, what I know, is that people are then not put in prison by their country of origin. So the argument for us of releasing people to then go to prison in another country that perhaps couldn't handle that, it doesn't arise. It may have arisen in the past, but I think at the moment that's not how things operate anymore. Maybe for America it could be different.
Okay.
Well,
I would
assume some instances where persons, if someone is serving a prison sentence in one state, arrangements can be made for them to serve the remainder of the sentence somewhere else, but that has to be done strictly by arrangement. When somebody is deported and that person enters the country, it's basically as a deportee. There is no issue of because the state that is sending that person would have already dealt with whatever is the criminal issue.
Whatever they did.
So that person may have served their time and being deported after serving the time. So it's a question of really receiving the deportee. It's not that receiving the deportee and then sending the deportee to prison. It is not a crime to be a deportee per se. So that when you arrive here, you can't be arrested and charged for being deported from the United States. You really and truly you are being sent home.
Well, not necessarily. So, what I was thinking of more so and maybe Attorney Winter Funde can speak to that. It's the option of having someone who already know that they will be deported, choose the option of, instead of serving time, I'm going to go back to my country. Are they going to be let into population, or do they have to serve any time in the prison from the hosting country?
Mm-hmm. So as it pertains to the United States, that's not an option. So if you have committed a crime, you won't say, oh, excuse me, send me home. I don't want to serve time. That is not an option. You will have to answer to those criminal charges. You will have to, sort those out first in the criminal setting. And then once you have served your time, and if and only if it's a deportable offense, right? So under the laws, the immigration laws of the United States, you must have been convicted of a deportable offense, meaning it's a crime that renders you deportable from the United States or removable. Once you have served your setting, whether you've gotten a 10-year sentence or a 15-year sentence, you then get placed into removal and you will be detained. So you're going to be in a detention center. You're not going to be at the jail or the prison from where you did your from where you served the time for your crime. You'll be placed in a detention center. At that point, you can say, send me home. I no longer want to fight. You can say that's it. So the detention is based only on the United States government saying you are removable because you committed that act. Once you get sent to your home country, you're not then criminalized or placed in, you're not incarcerated. You've already served your time. In Jamaica, you're processed. There is an agency that does a little bit of like homecoming, where you're processed and hopefully family members will be there to receive you. And you are, I hate to use the word released, you are free to go home once you land in your home country.
Gotcha. Which makes sense. I know you touched on it a little bit, and one of the things we were concerned about is the criteria for deportation. I do know, as you said, it has to be a deportationable offense. Does it matter whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor, or are there certain misdemeanors that can earn you or earn the U.S. the right to deport you? Just like the UK also can address that. But Ms. Winterfunde, are there certain levels of crime that is considered deportable?
Yes. If you look at the Immigration and Nationality Act, there are a couple ways that you can be placed in removal. And Attorney Ruggles touched on one earlier, is that you've simply overstayed. I like to call those you're harmless individuals, meaning they came to the United States on a valid visa and they overstayed. And for some reason, they came in interaction with law enforcement or with immigration and custom enforcement, and they're placed in removal. The other set of individuals are those that have committed a crime. The Immigration and Nationality Act lists all the crimes that can make you deportable. It could be a crime, and typically we call them, some of them, crime of moral turpitude, your burglaries, your robbery, your rapes, your drug offenses. And of course, with the drug offenses, it depends on the amount of drugs. If you're caught transporting drugs, then you can be certainly placed in removal. So there's a list of offenses in the Immigration and Nationality Act that if you're convicted of such offense, then yes, the United States, they're big on domestic violence. If you are arrested, convicted of domestic violence, certainly you can catch the attention of Immigration and Custom Enforcement. So there are all these offenses that if you're convicted of, then certainly you can be placed in removal proceedings. And let me wrap up by saying, simply because you're arrested, you have a green card or you're here unlawfully and you are arrested. It's not like they grab you and place you on the next flight out. There are some procedures in place where you will get your day in court if you so desire. You will get your day in court and you'll get an opportunity to defend the proceeding that is brought against you.
Understandable. So that clarifies it, because I do hear a lot of, and it would be rumors, I guess, that even based on deportation, that you have the option to say, well, I don't want to do my time, send me back to my country. But as you stated, that's definitely farce and so forth. So thanks for clearing that up for us. Mm-hmm. Now, I know, Brother Steve, you had a question, and I'd like to entertain it at this time for any one of our attorneys.
Yes. Yes. This goes out to anyone that wishes to answer. In regards to people that are nationalized citizens, there are some countries that does not accept dual citizenship. Okay. Now, if someone in the UK or the US commit a crime, could their citizenship be revoked, and would they be forced to go back to their place of origin, their birth country? Is it possible?
I can take that one because we've got quite a topical case of the young lady. I don't know how much UK news everybody gets around the world, but we've got a young lady, Shamima Begum, who left the UK age 15. Her parents are Bangladeshi, and she was born in the UK. She left the UK and went to Syria to fight jihad, and wanted to now come back. She's otherwise British. And the Home Office have said that no, and she doesn't actually have a Bangladeshi passport, but the Home Office has said no, because she's entitled to a Bangladeshi passport through her parentage. We are therefore revoking her UK citizenship, and she can therefore not enter the United Kingdom. So that's an extreme case, because usually it's only if you're not British that they will then start deportation proceedings against you or exclusion proceedings against you if you're outside the UK. But that's a case where, and there have been other cases actually, where the UK has said no, because you're entitled to another citizenship. So that would answer the question that certainly if you did have another citizenship, there are instances where the UK will revoke your British citizenship and then not allow you to enter the UK, or if you're in the UK, to deport you.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yes, well, in Grenada and some of the Caribbean countries, you can have dual citizenship, of course. It would be difficult to revoke the citizenship of your birth. So if you are born in Grenada, a citizenship acquired may be more prone to revocation than certainly the citizenship of your birth. So while we don't have examples as raised by my colleague in the UK, very interesting example. But once you are born in a country, so for example, if you acquire Grenadian citizenship, then you yourself can give up the citizenship. You can revoke it, while the state may, under certain circumstances, revoke it. But your country of first citizenship, your country of birth, that would I'm yet to see an example of that, certainly in this part of the world.
Makes sense, and it would be understandable that it supersedes. Now, Attorney Winter Funde, could you speak to that in terms of the U.S.?
Absolutely. So denaturalization. So if you're born in the U.S., certainly any crime you commit, you're good. You'll go to prison, you'll come back out, and you'll go home, right? So if you're born here, there's no question. Even if you're born, like my son was born here, and I'm Jamaican, so I jokingly tell him he's good. He can do whatever he wants. He can become president. He can do all that. If you are a naturalized citizen, in the case of myself, I was naturalized here in the United States. My daughter was naturalized. In cases like that, there is a process rarely ever used because it's so because now you're a citizen, so you're protected under the United States Constitution. So you have to be denaturalized. One of the acts they look for is if you renounce your citizenship. For example, I'll use my colleague in London. If you go off to Syria and decide that you're going to fight against the United States with a terrorist organization, then they can begin denaturalization proceedings against you. It is quite a gruesome proceeding. I've been doing this for over 15 years and I've never had a case like that, because the question then becomes, what are your constitutional rights? Because you are now a United States citizen. But yes, it can be done. I've just never been a party to anyone being naturalized. Outside of watching the media, I've never been a party to that. With served as counsel.
Understood. Well, thank you so much for that. We're going to take a station break, as we normally will. And just remember, you're on Plain Talk with Veron Richards and our panelists speaking on immigration issues that are facing our Caribbean nationals at this time. So please stay with us. We'll be back shortly, and we have some more resources for you. We have joining us Attorney Lavina Latham from Canada, who can also provide us a perspective from Canada, because we do have a lot of Caribbean nationals that are living in Canada. She'll be on shortly, who should be able to provide us with some additional perspectives. Thank you so much.
Hey, did you know that the census is due this year on April 1st? And guess what? This time we can finally count as Caribbean. This year, all you have to do is 1, check the race box, and 2, write in your country of birth or ancestry. You can answer by the paper form, online, or by phone. Everybody counts in Census 2020. So count as Caribbean. Yes, we count.
Thank you so much for returning. We're back, and we're definitely addressing some of the immigration issues that are basically of major concerns to to all of our Caribbean nationals at this time, especially during COVID. And we're trying to get our attorneys. We have professionals online, and they're providing this information for free. So guys, log in, tell your friend, tell your family, everyone can listen in, because it might be of some utmost importance to them. So I'm actually waiting to hear from one of our added panelists, but until then, we're going to speak on one issue that I thought of in terms of the same deportation, well, more so naturalization, because I know we're going to go back to that deportation relative to Canada on that issue, but I'd like to speak on it, something that I kind of fell into, and I know a lot of us Caribbean nationals are not aware of some aspects of naturalization that it's out there. And I guess if you didn't have the legal knowledge, you may not know that you're entitled. I know that as a teenager coming into the US, based on my parents' status at that time, I was told even then that my parents, while I'm a minor, my parents can actually file a process and I'll become a citizen without having to go through my own filing process. I was told more recently that you can actually be it's a grandfather, and I looked at it as, but it's called derivative naturalization. Now, I was told recently that you cannot necessarily age out of it. You don't have to be a minor. And so I'd like to have Attorney Winter-Funde to speak on that. If you can, just expound a little bit more on that aspect, please.
All right. I jokingly laugh because I've had many Caribbean people or people from the continent, and they'll say, "Oh, my grandfather in." So they'll say they've grandfathered into that, and I love it. I absolutely love it. So the process is, if you arrived in the United States with a green card and you're under the age of 18 at the time, and one of your biological parents is a United States citizen, so either mom or dad is a United States citizen, then you have derived citizenship from that parent. And even if at the time you entered, one of the parents were not a naturalized citizen, but they became a naturalized citizen before you turned to the age of 18, then you would have derived citizenship from that parent. What a lot of people they misconstrue is that, okay, I didn't do anything physically, so did I get this naturalization? And my answer is yes. You don't have to, it doesn't mean that you have done something physically in order to be classified as a naturalized citizen. So long as there's records, you can prove that you had your green card, you were under the age of 18, and one of your biological parents were a naturalized citizen, then you will derive citizenship from that parent. So for example, Johnny is now 25. Johnny has gotten in trouble with immigration because all he has is a green card. He's committed what we call a deportable offense. One of the first things I do is I backtrack Johnny's immigration history just to see whether one or any of his biological parents were citizens before he turned to the age of 18. And that will move Johnny out of the classification of green card holder into a naturalized citizen. So he will have less problems with immigration. So it's not something that you age out of. It's just a matter of filing what we call the N-600 application, and then you can get your United States citizenship certificate. Even if you have not done so, you have not lost that right. So if you haven't heard anything I've said, just keep in mind you cannot age out of it, even if you have not done anything physically to obtain that naturalization. For some people, they can go out and get the United States passport. That still shows that they are a United States citizen. I hope that answers your question, Veron.
Yes, it does. And actually, the one you mentioned, the passport, the latter, I've heard. The N-600, I wasn't aware of, but I heard that if you apply for a U.S. passport based on your parents' naturalization certificate, yes, then that automatically gains you that citizenship right. So,
all right.
Thank
and
you
I
so
want
much
you
for that
to
clarity.
So keep in mind, you have the right with or without the physical document. Don't attach the right to the physical document. You still have the right, even if you didn't apply for the passport before you turned 18. Just keep that in mind, because I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes in.
Right. So for instance, if your parents, because you know some people via moving or whatever the case might be, they may not have that or access to that naturalization certificate. Now, is there any way that they can actually get evidence of it, or do they have to reapply for that certificate in order for that child to apply for that or to earn that right?
Yes, we need proof that the parent is a naturalized citizen. And yes, if they've lost their certificate, they can apply to the service for a replacement. These certificates are super costly, so I always advise to keep in a safe place.
Definitely. Yeah, keep those documents. Keep those documents.
You're welcome.
And I know at one point, even the green cards, I think initially there were no expiration dates on them, but it seemed like over time, I say it's a money-making gesture. But
it is a business.
Okay.
The service is a business, and the service is run by fees. I don't know if you saw where recently they are running out of funds and they plan to increase fees with all the offices and consulates being closed. The service is now throwing out a 10% fee increase across the board. So green cards now expire after 10 years and you have to pay to renew them. And like you said, it's a very profitable business.
It is. It is. Now, do any of our panelists, Dr. Z, do you have a question for our panelists? I can definitely take one at this time. Oh, Brother Steve, go ahead, please.
This question is for my beautiful sister from the UK. We have years ago, before these islands like Grenada and Southern Islands it was not given independence. There were times back when you would find the governments of the UK would take a lot of guys from the Caribbean and bring them in to fight battles, to go into war. And it's, to my understanding, there's some people never really went in and get their status together or get something situated. And my understanding is that there are times when they were being threatened to be deported. Can you give us any kind of enlightenment on that, as far as people that was, that was brought into England, and are they facing any kind of difficulties in being deported?
So that's probably the Windrush scandal, as we call it, which around about 2017-18, it became a big issue that the UK had been deporting people who had come from the Caribbean very legally and had been here from the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. And in 1983, well, I should say 1981 actually, and the law became enforceable on the 1st of January 1983. So people had to get their British citizenship. They had to become British, which is a different way to naturalizing, because, as you say, they were British because they were in the Caribbean under the colonies. So when they arrived in the United Kingdom, they were still here as British citizens or with the right of abode. But as immigration law got more and more difficult and the Home Office started to clamp down on illegal migration, these people who were in the UK from the Caribbean for sometimes up to 40 years never got their paperwork to show that they were legally in the UK. In the same way that a white British person doesn't get their paperwork either. You're born here, you just come in, you just grow up and assume that you're British, which you are. The same way that people from the Caribbean came and they assumed they were British, which they were, and they just carried on living here. But when immigration clamped down, and by virtue, I suppose, of not looking British, a lot of people were asked for their work papers to show that they could work, papers to show that they could rent a property, papers to show that they could get a mortgage, open a bank account, etc. They couldn't show any of these things because they didn't have the papers. They didn't have those naturalization or registration documents. And therefore, we saw many people who were basically thrown out of their homes, thrown out of their jobs, bank accounts closed, and in some instances, people were deported. And even if you've arrived in the United Kingdom before the 1st of January 1973 and commit a criminal offence, as a starting point, you're not supposed to be deported no matter what you've done. So people were wrongfully deported, and it was just a hot mess, basically. So the UK has since implemented what's called the Windrush scheme, and they have fast-tracked a lot of people's applications to either give them British citizenship or indefinite leave to remain, which is, I think, the American version of a green card, which just means you can stay here permanently. So they've given those people that, and people who have been deported to the Caribbean, or in some instances, people went on holiday to the Caribbean and couldn't return, particularly elderly people, because they'd go with their Grenadian passport, which didn't have a British document in there, arrive in Grenada because they're Grenadian, but when they then want to return back to the UK after their 6-week holiday, because they didn't get a visa in their Grenadian passport and because they didn't get their British papers, they then could not show that they were entitled to return. And we found that, I mean, there was a lady from Jamaica. She'd been stuck in Jamaica, I think, for about 30 years. I've had clients who were in Nigeria. She left here when she was 2, went to Nigeria over 30 years ago, and we've only just managed to get her British citizenship sorted under the Windrush scheme. So it was a whole horrible saga and scandal, which the Home Office have tried to clear up. And if anybody has been able to sort out their papers through the Windrush scheme, then they are also entitled to what we call Windrush compensation. So the government has set aside £200 million to compensate these people from the Commonwealth who came here quite legally and then were effectively thrown out of the country and thrown out of society as well. So it's been a whole scandal. What I should say, actually, is the Windrush scheme and compensation is available for anybody who arrived in the UK as a British citizen or with the right of abode or indefinite leave to remain before the 31st of December 1988. And if you come into that category, no matter whether you're in the UK or in any country in the world, particularly a Commonwealth country, then you may have a claim to re-enter under the Windrush scheme, and you may have a claim to compensation even if you don't want to re-enter. Your direct close relatives can also claim compensation if they were affected, if you're the main applicant. And if the person has died, because many people died whilst trying to sort out their papers. There was a Grenadian gentleman who died, I think it was about 2 years ago in the UK, whilst trying to sort out his papers, although he'd been here for 50 years. So if somebody has died, then the estate can also claim the compensation.
Thank you so much. Yeah, before we continue, I do have joining guest Lavina Latham, and I'd love to have her introduce herself to us, our audience, and we have a few questions for everyone. So, Mrs. Latham, thank you and welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity tonight to chat with you. My name is Lavinia Latham. I'm a human rights lawyer here in Canada, specifically in Ontario. My practice is largely within the areas of anti-Black racism. So, dealing with claims as they relate to discrimination on the basis of race. Right now, at the moment, my practice is actually on pause. I work with a school board in the city, the Toronto Catholic District School Board, as their equity and human rights advisor. So the way I like to cement the understanding of what I do is as opposed to litigation human rights law, which is largely where I come from. Some of the cases that I've done include cases that have gone to the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada is the highest court in the land, and just really creating a test case litigation that's going to be used in future cases to kind of untangle some of the current cases that we depend on that lean themselves to less equitable results. And all the specific cases that I've been involved with, I don't want to get too specific about those cases, but all of that information is, of course, available on my website. That's lavinialatham.com. But now, instead of litigation, which is a very it's a reactive approach. So something goes wrong, you respond, you sue. Now I'm dealing with human rights from more of a proactive approach. So legal policy, helping the organization actually develop a strategy and a way to avoid some of the inequitable situations that they find themselves in that ultimately end up in litigation. So essentially that's what I do. And I'm happy to talk today about how, coronavirus and the situation that we find ourselves in right now, what that means in terms of human rights law and what we see for disenfranchised communities here in Canada. So thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you so much for joining. Well, now that you spoke to that, we do have an email question, and I think everyone might be able to chime in, including you. Definitely right up your alley. It states here that someone posed the statement that there are work and travel students currently in the U.S. and they're being asked to sign waivers so that their programs would not be terminated. But within those waivers, there are parts that said that the sponsors will no longer be responsible for them and that their medical insurance will be cut, etc. But some of them spend more than $12,000, $120,000 EC, etc., to come to the program. And they sign contracts stating that in case we lose our jobs or so, our host company, the sponsors, will. I'm not sure. So I guess they're saying that the host company, their sponsors are supposed to take care of them. Can anyone speak to that? And it's right up your alley, Mrs. Latham. So Attorney Latham, if you want to start off with that, you can.
Yeah. So the difficulty in responding to a question like that, that's very case specific, and it sounds like it's very specific to that jurisdiction. Here in Canada, I'm licensed to practice law in the province of Ontario. So because that case is so jurisdiction specific, I'm hesitant to respond to it. I also want to preface anything that I say further with the disclaimer, so to speak, that this is not legal advice. It's really just information to help assist with those kinds of questions. I can say that here in Canada, if something like that had come across my desk and I was still practicing litigation, that would be the kind of case that I would say has a contractual element to it. It sounds like there was a promise made within this contract and that there was a breach to that contract. So I would lean on our civil litigation system, or our civil litigation process rather, to deal with that. Now, if it's a class of individuals who are protected under the Ontario Human Rights Code or under the Canadian Human Rights Act, then assessing that to see if there's actually what we like to call a prima facie case of discrimination, that prima facie meaning on its face. So right away, we can see that there's a class of individuals who have historically experienced some form of systemic discrimination. So for the purposes of this conversation, say, for example, a group of Black migrant workers in this case, right? That in that case, that's a protected ground. We could argue that, you know, they're being discriminated against on the protected ground of race. And then we can determine, do the elements of the situation, the facts itself, does that point towards something that a case for discrimination could be made? And then once we're able to show that in an application to either the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal or in the case of a federal matter before the Canadian Human Rights Commission, if we're able to show that, then you know, it would be up to the court to move forward with that. But again, I know that's kind of like a more wider response to a very specific question. But unfortunately, because I'm not a lawyer in that jurisdiction, I cannot answer that question.
And understandably so.
Can I chime in? Can I chime in?
Definitely, I was coming to you because I was saying. Go right ahead.
Sorry. I'll chime in here because what we're seeing here is the nightmare that we call them our H-2B workers. These, I think this might either be a seasonal worker from the Caribbean or farm worker programs. We know them, the bread and butter of the Caribbean. So these individuals have signed these documents and they're coming into the United States to work. What's happening is whether they're picking strawberries, whether they're working in the hospitality industry, what's happening is that these industries, a lot of them are being affected by COVID-19. I recommend that all of these individuals contact an attorney, and here's why. A lot of these employers have collected here, and I'm speaking jurisdictionally within the United States, right? I'm not speaking for the United Kingdom or for Canada or any other Caribbean country. Region. Within the United States, they have collected what we call funds or loans from the government to help to kind of prop up the industry until it starts running again. What they're essentially asking these employees to do is to sign or waive away their rights, because as part of that contractual agreement that my colleague from Canada spoke about, it was that this host will take care of these employees while they are working within the United States. So if I'm picking strawberries or oranges in Florida, or I'm in Maine or North Carolina working in the hotel industry, you, the employer, will be responsible for my food and board, and then you'll pay me X dollars for this period of time. Right. With COVID-19, a lot of these employers are now going out of business or they've lost business. So they want to walk away from these contractual arrangements by saying, look, I will no longer be responsible for your medical. I will no longer be responsible for your housing, and I will no longer be responsible for your food. In the meantime, these employees cannot travel because their home countries, the borders are closed. So it's definitely what we would call a ripe set of facts for discrimination. It's a ripe set of facts for treating these seasonal workers poorly, which we've seen time and time and time again. They're getting taken advantage of. So I would encourage any individual, and I hope the individual that wrote the email is listening in, to contact an attorney where they can work something out with these employers, because for one, these employees have nowhere to go. Most of them they come here for the 4 or 6 months, and it's to work for these employers and then return to their home country. So certainly we're seeing a lot of this going on. I have received calls such as this, and it is case specific, but I would encourage them before they sign anything with these employers, contact an attorney before they do so.
Okay. Definitely.
And I will concur with that position. Yeah, I was just saying that I concur with that position because you don't want to sign away your rights and relieve the employer of his or
their
her
duty
or its obligations under the contract. It is important that people who are so affected check an attorney and ensure. And in a period like this, the issue of negotiating fairly. Of course, COVID affects everybody. COVID affects employers. COVID affects employees. And really and truly, one has to seek to share the burden, try to strike a balance, and operate fairly and negotiate. As one attorney, I believe in Brazil, I was on a session a few days ago, and you're saying negotiate, because it's a period that's challenging for everybody, but you don't leave the employee necessarily just holding the bag and free yourself of all obligations and use COVID as an excuse to do so. So it's important that people are well advised legally as to what their rights are before they go and sign them all away.
If I may add to that, one of the things that we see in litigation when there are claims of discrimination or claims of unjust treatment on the basis of race, we see this argument that somehow, some way, the person was at fault. So say, for example, in this case with migrant workers, say a class of individuals come before the court with an action, and they state, or in our language here, with an application before the tribunal, and they state that they've been experiencing unfair treatment underneath this contract, and it's on the basis of race. What we see is kind of like a throwing of a salad at a wall of all the other excuses in the world as to why it's something else and not particularly race. So pre-COVID, what that might look like is, oh, well, that migrant worker was lazy, or that migrant worker has behavioral issues, or that migrant worker, something to do with the migrant worker that has nothing to do with race. Like, or I gave this person tons of opportunities to change and fix their behavior, and they just didn't. Meanwhile, if you peel back the layers of that onion a bit, you can see that there's an underlying current of racism, because perhaps that person was disciplined unfairly for every single thing that they did. Perhaps they were late for work by 2 minutes, and that 2 minutes turned into another black mark on their record of their attendance. And all these things are used as evidence in court. I bring that up because now that we're in coronavirus, this whole COVID-19 pandemic thing, I feel, and I think I could quite accurately predict that some of the counter arguments that's going to be coming down the pipeline is, as my colleague has mentioned, it all has to do with this pandemic. And the problem with that is that when we are making these kinds of arguments before the court here in Canada, and again, all of my comments are as they relate to Canada, what ends up happening is a decision maker, a trier of fact, will look at that particular set of circumstances using what we call the reasonable person test. And the reasonable person test essentially is, what would a reasonable person in this circumstance with these set of facts, how would that person decide? What would that person think in that particular scenario? In actuality, no one really knows who the reasonable person is, but in practice, the reasonable person is usually a Eurocentric white man. And so what I can see coming down the pipeline when you start talking about these breach contracts, you start talking about maybe an instance of racism or discrimination, now you're going to have a reliance on this whole coronavirus pandemic. So, and that being the reason why everything is what it is. And it's a strong argument. That's the danger of it. It's a very strong argument. If somebody loses their job because of coronavirus, there's so many different places that you can point to evidence to show that there's a correlation between what has happened in the pandemic and why this person is losing their job, or this person's not realizing their benefits under the contract. So I just want to highlight to everybody that we are in a scenario where if you are part of a class of individuals who have historically been disenfranchised, treated unfairly, just not dealt with right, chances are likely that that situation is going to be exacerbated even more so right now under the umbrella of, oh, well, it's coronavirus.
COVID.
And that is so true, because what you find is that most of the people who are affected by this, they do not have the funds to really hire a good lawyer who can represent them. So are there anything being put in place where these people can get either free service or some low-cost service so they can fight for their rights?
Yes. So here in Canada, and one of the organizations that I had the absolute joy of working for early in my career, the name of it was the African Canadian Legal Clinic. And so in that role, we were providing free legal services to the Black community here in Canada to, kind of respond to some of these issues. And that's how we ended up at the Supreme Court of Canada over 24 times, successfully changing law in a way that would benefit the Black community. Now that clinic has actually been dismantled and a new one is in its place. It's called the Black Legal Action Center. So here in Canada, we do have a legal aid system that's funded primarily by the federal taxpayers, provincial taxpayers. So that's the situation in Canada. If you're not able to get a lawyer for these issues, because you're absolutely right, these soft issues or soft legal issues, or legal rights rather, are really only available to those who have the wherewithal, the financial wherewithal to go and fight those cases in court. And so these legal aid communities or legal aid clinics rather, are available to help people access that. So that's the situation here in Canada. I'm not sure what it looks like in the UK and the States.
It's about in the UK and US.
Yes, I definitely would love to hear from Attorney Okello on that issue. And unfortunately, it's almost that time. We're got to wrap up, guys. So just Attorney Okello, and then we can get some wrap up comments from the panels.
Yeah, there's just a few things I want to say practically in terms of the UK, and I'll just say it so that people get the advice really. This is general advice, obviously, but just if you're a student and you're doing anything to do with the NHS or medical in terms of helping the UK fight the coronavirus and you're not studying, you can now work as many hours as you wish to work, as you're able to work under the Home Office provisions to deal with coronavirus. So students, even if you can't study, you can still go out there and work. And also your employer as well, the government has offered to pay up to 80% of people's income. So your employer can apply for that without actually dismissing somebody. They can apply to get assistance with your wages up to 80%. However, if your employer then says you can't work for whatever reason, yes, get employment advice. But also, if you're, as most people are, a migrant in the UK and you can't access public funds, you can now make an application to the Home Office to vary the conditions of your status in the UK so that you can now get benefits. So you can make that application. And there's information about all this on my website, which is at clarityvisas.com, and also on our Facebook page at Clarity Visas.
Thank you so much. This is a wealth of information here, guys. I so thank you for joining us. I know it's almost that time. We got 2 minutes left. And so we would like to do a wrap-up comment from each one of our panelists. I so thank you once again. I couldn't thank you enough for committing and being present for us this evening. I think we've gotten so much information on just a login. So we can start with Attorney Ruggles. We haven't heard from you in a moment. Can you give us your wrap-up comment, and we'll move on up to the US and so forth.
Okay, well, very interesting program.
Attorney Ruggles?
COVID-19 has raised many challenges. Challenges relating to constitutional issues, as we heard, freedom of movement issues, challenges relating to human rights generally and contractual issues in particular, employer-employee relationships and so. But it also presents many opportunities in terms of the way we do things, the way we engage in business, even, having programs like these. And I wish to commend your entity, Junior and others, for having a program such as this. Very interesting. Drawing attorneys from, different jurisdictions and sharing experiences. Like my colleague in Canada said, it's mainly informational, but it provides information and education. But for those who may have specific issues, it's still very important to check an attorney and to be advised on specific legal issues.
Thank you so much. Attorney Winter Funde.
I commend RIdealong for bringing programs like these to individuals from the Caribbean. I also want to tip my hat to all my colleagues in the United Kingdom, Canada, Grenada, Connecticut, New York. It was a pleasure to have conversations like this. Let's not end here, right? Let's not end the discussion here. Let us continue this discussion so all individuals from the Caribbean can benefit. I am in Florida. I am willing to talk to my seasonal workers because I understand the restrictions on finances. I am willing to talk to them about what rights they have because yes, they do have some rights. I am at winterimmigration.com. winterimmigration.com. And again, thank you for giving us this platform so we can give back to our community. Thank you.
And that's Winter, WYNTER, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you so much. Now, we have Ms. Latham, Lavinia Latham. Is there anything that you would like to say to wrap up?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, I echo the sentiments of my learned friends about how fantastic this opportunity is to share this information with our community. It starts here. Knowledge is power, and it's very important to be made aware of the rights and the different legal vehicles that are available to you during this time. One thing that I want to leave everyone with, especially if you're right here in Canada, is, or actually, you know what? I guess this could be global, and I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, but what you can do in this time is to document everything. Because, if it comes down to a situation where you are at a tribunal, you are before a court, you are trying to, uphold your human rights, it really does come down to evidence. And so the smallest piece of evidence can really make the difference in the success of your litigation process. And so I would really urge that, you document things. So if that means a text message or a picture or whatever. So in the circumstances itself, as something is happening, if a situation is unfolding and you find yourself in circumstances that are just starting to unravel and they're getting worse and worse and worse, do what you can for yourself in that moment to mitigate your consequences, to mitigate your situation. So what does that mean? We see a lot of situations in the news right now where somebody is pulled over by the police and they're manhandled and, some people lose their life, right? In that moment, do what you need to do to get out of that situation in a healthy way. So that's pretty much what I would leave it at right now. Do what you need to do to get out of that situation, and then document everything, and then use the evidence that you've documented, the evidence that you've collected to go after in a litigation process. I'm available to chat further about any of this. My website, again, is lavinialatham.com. And there's a contact feature there. There's a form if you have any questions or you need to be pointed in the right direction with Canadian resources. I'm very happy to point anyone in the right direction or to assist directly as well. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
And thank you so much for joining us. And I'm not sure if Attorney Okello, you have any final words that you'd like to leave with us before we actually close?
Well, it's been a wonderful program. I think it's about 1 o'clock in the morning now here in the UK. So I've really enjoyed this global conversation. And it's been really interesting to hear from the views from across the world. Anybody who wants to know more about what I've said in terms of UK immigration, because that's the only immigration that I practice, then we're at clarityvisas.com. And on Facebook, we're at Clarity Visas. And we offer a free case assessment just to make sure that you do have a case before you spend any money on legal advice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. Dr. Z, Brother Steve, Attorney Fun. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it. There's so much that I've learned, so much that the audience have learned. And as I said, it was free. So, guys, I really, really appreciate your commitment for coming on and educating our Caribbean nationals on immigration issues. Thank you, guys, for tuning in, and we'll see you soon again. Good night to all, and
good night.
I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, did you know that the census is due this year on April 1st? And guess what? This time we can finally count as Caribbean. This year, all you have to do is 1, check the race box, and 2, write in your country of birth or ancestry. You can answer by the paper form, online, or by phone. Everybody counts in Census 2020. So count as Caribbean. Yes, we count.
Fresh.